very happy to we're very happy to welcome today Kati Prajda, who is a postdoctoral research scholar in the Department of History at the University of Vienna. She studies the co-evolution of diplomacy, migration, arts, and society in medieval and early Renaissance Italy. Her first monograph, Network and Migration in Early Renaissance Florence, 1378 to 1433, Friends of Friends in the Kingdom of Hungary, which was published in 2018 by Amsterdam University Press, explores the role of social networks in cultural exchanges from an interdisciplinary perspective. She's currently working on a third book, the first one in Italian, which is called Mare Nostrum Adriaticum, Le Nazioni Mercantili in Lotta per l'Alto Adriatico. And this book will provide a new understanding of the dominion of the Upper Adriatic, which decenters the struggle between Venice and Hungary in favor of the role of various trading nations, the role the various trading nations played in the history and development of the area. Today, however, she's going to be talking about her most recent monograph, which is entitled Italy and Hungary in the Early Renaissance, Cultural Exchanges and Social Networks, which was published at the end of last year by Viella. So thank you very much indeed for joining us, Kati. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Alex, for the kind invitation. Monik, Brian, thank you all for joining. As an introduction, I'd like to say a few words about how the idea of the book was born and about the ways I arrived to this topic. And I need to go back quite a bit in time, exactly to 2007, when I was a first-year graduate student at the European University Institute, writing my thesis with Tony Moho. Back then, some of my former professors from the art history department at Eötvös Loránd University, Budapest, were involved in the organization of an international conference at the Villaitati Harvard University Center for Renaissance Studies. And the main focus of the conference was humanism and artistic contacts between Italy and Hungary in the early Renaissance period. And papers were delivered by some of the leading experts of the field, among them many of my former professors, including Péter Farbaki, who is one of the organizers of the conference, the Italian-Hungarian expert, the late Miklós Boskovics, American scholars like Lou Waldman, who is the other organizer, and Brenda Pryor and Joseph Connors. Obviously, he was back then the director of the Villaitati. And out of the official program, Péter Farbaki back then asked me to deliver a small talk about the preliminary results of my archival research on Florentine-Hungarian relations. And I still recall some of the memorable moments of the conference, and there were many. And in the foreword, in the foreword of the conference proceedings published in 2011 by Harvard University Press, Joseph Connors mentioned, and now I quote, that Hungary, the first country outside the Italian peninsula and the Venetian possessions of Dalmatia, to receive and nurture the Italian Renaissance, end of the quote. In the introduction, the two organizers of the conference and editors of the volume, Farbaki and Waldman, stated, and I quote again, the influence of humanism and early Renaissance art had already made itself known in Hungary in the 15th century. And in this process, art historians entitled a leading role to Matthias Corvinus and his court. In the introduction of the volume, Farbaki and Waldman also recalled the ways Hungarian Renaissance research in Italy emerged between the two world wars. They mentioned, for example, Charles de Tournai, who's the founder and the director of the Casa Bonarte in Florence, and some, I think, definitely less known Hungarian art historians. But they left aside such, I think, more important figures than Frederick Antal. One of the reasons might be, and I talk about this in one of my last articles appeared with the Italy studies in 2022, the profound methodological differences that divided Antal and his theory about the social embeddedness of Florentine art, and some of the leading art historians such as Boskovics and his former fellow students in Hungary about the ways they saw Florentine art of the period. And as an undergraduate at the art history department in Budapest, these methodological differences led me to study the social and not ultimately the financial economic foundations of the supposedly close relations between Hungary and Italy, which according to scholarship had already manifested in the 14th century. Until that point, besides sporadic research carried out by two Hungarian scholars at the beginning of the 20th century and later in the 1990s, archival research on Florentine-Hungarian relations were virtually non-existent. And the discoveries were summarized in four scientific articles altogether, which were primarily based on a 19th century collection of documents compiled by an erudite Hungarian scholar. And back then, that was the quite only literature available on the topic. So my starting point in writing this book, the idea of the book, was somehow rooted in the social history of art. And I wish to explore the social and economic basis which led art historians to emphasize the uniqueness of Hungary in the spread of the Italian Renaissance beyond the peninsula. More than a decade later, then, when the same Vilai Tatti offered me a fellowship for the academic year 2019-2020, the main goal of my project was to write a history of the relationships between the various polities of the peninsula and the territories of the Hungarian-Croatian Crown to supplement somehow the existing theories about this strong artistic connection. My project was kind of ambitious indeed, and I must admit, I proposed to undertake a thorough research in some of the most significant archives located through Italy to explore and some hidden, unknown, and long forgotten, maybe written and probably also visual testimonies to these intense contacts. And as we all know, then COVID happened that spring, and so most of my plans for archival research and also for library research beyond and outside Florence and Rome quite completely vanished. And it was not until 2021 spring that I had once again access, even though sporadically, and with strong restrictions to archival material, but also to library material. So the gap year I took in the academic year 2020-2021 to finalize my book manuscript was entirely dedicated to this missing period of archival research. And much of the actual writing of the book took place during the last lockdown we experienced in Italy. That was in the spring 2021. And those of you with whom we are following each other on social media might remember that I was posting pictures about the completely empty Florentine city center. And it was both an interesting and frightening experience. So I had nothing else to do, just concentrate on the manuscript itself. And it took almost 3 years to get it published for different reasons, because obviously while talking with colleagues and exchanging ideas, I have rewritten several parts. And then I needed to find a publisher. So it was a long process. So now I'd like to say a few words about the structure of the book and its main arguments. So the book doesn't try to challenge this vision of the art historians, whether or not Hungary truly had the primacy in the spread of the early Renaissance outside the peninsula. I think such an ambitious project would require a lifetime and a strong interdisciplinary team to investigate the question in various parts of Europe. Rather, the main goal of the book is to unveil the reasons which led art historians to entitle such a primacy to Hungary. Besides that, the book has definitely another objective. The main objective is to decenter the various relationships between Italian polities and some of the Western European political powers by focusing on a no less significant political entity in the East Central part of the continent. And I do so because I believe that very often discourses about medieval and early modern European history project back the modern division of Eastern and Western Europe onto these two historical periods. So through the book, I employ the Italian-Hungarian relations as a case study to analyze larger patterns and trends in cultural transmission and agency. So the introduction of the book is centered on three main issues. First, the periodization of the Renaissance, what we call in this context early Renaissance. Then cross-cultural changes and the problematics connected to this, and the study of social networks and the implication of social network analysis in medieval and Renaissance studies. And in the book, I use the term early Renaissance in a quite broad sense, as the present monograph considers cross-cultural exchanges between various Italian political entities and the Kingdom of Hungary, Croatia from an interdisciplinary perspective, including the Renaissance style, but most importantly, humanism, society, diplomacy, and economy. It was reasonable to find a starting date that would resonate with the history of all these territories and fields of inquiry. So the near coincidence between the Black Death and Louis I's coronation to King of Hungary in 1342 makes it sensible to collocate the beginning of the narrative around that time. However, I believe that the narrative or what was happening afterwards needs to be put into perspective of the events happening in the 1330s, exactly when the Hungarian prince Andrew arrives to Naples, and when we have information on the employment of the first Italian in the Hungarian royal administration. Similarly, the end date of the book has been defined primarily by Matthias Corvinus' death in 1490, which coincided more or less with the French invasion preceded by Lorenzo de' Medici's and Innocent VII's death. Besides these considerations, in art history scholarship, the spread of the Renaissance in Hungary is traditionally linked to the period immediately following Matthias' reign. And in Italy, instead, according to Bošković periodization, it is already a part of the High Renaissance because Bošković ends the early Renaissance around Masaccio in 1428. And one of the meta-narratives my book addresses about the Renaissance culture and history is the development of the Italian Renaissance culture fueled by the exchanges with other cultures. And numerous studies have drawn and articulated the local Italian artistic production, how it flourished in the context of commercial networks and the intensification on the global scale. And most typically discussions concern specific aspects of cross-fertilization with the Muslim world or with Western Europe. Alongside commercial goods, ideas and cultural models traveled by merchant networks. And among these popular topics are also contacts between Italy and Western Europe, for example, the Low Countries, the Kingdom of England, and Germany. However, one should emphasize that the definition of the term culture based on ethnic or linguistic grounds has many limits, especially in the context of the Hungarian, so-called Hungarian and Italian relations. We are all familiar, I think, with the multi-ethnic character of some of the most significant Italian cities, for example, Venice, but also Rome, Genoa, and in a minor share, also the Tuscan towns show a sort of cultural diversity. In Venice and in Rome, for example, the most extended foreign communities were composed of those speaking German or a Slavic language. And we should emphasize here that the cultural diversity of the territories of the Hungarian-Croatian Crown was no less strong. And the kingdom shall be rightfully called the melting pot of various linguistic, religious, ethnic traditions. Because besides Hungarians, the population included predominantly those speaking a Slavic language, Northern or Southern Slavic languages, German, especially in the so-called royal towns, which were local or international centers of trade, as well as Neo-Latin languages, for example, by the Vlach population, and also Turkic languages by a nomadic ethnic group, the Kumans, who lived in Hungary since the 13th century. And the religious diversity of the population was no less significant than there were Eastern and Western Christians, Jews, and sometimes even Muslims mentioned in the sources. Thus, I think rather than categorizing the two groups like Italians and Hungarians, based entirely on this undefinable, in these circumstances, undefinable values of ethnicity and language, this study considers them as a single society divided between cultural creators and cultural consumers, just like in sociology and the theory of cultural diamond developed by Wendy Griswold I'm using here. So to challenge the traditional view of the scholarship, in the book I talk briefly also about, in this context, the pseudo-Hungarians, who are mentioned as Hungarians, for example, in Italian sources, but in reality, we know that they are Italians working in Hungary. And I also mention a case of a Florentine who is mentioned as such in the Hungarian sources, but in reality, it then turns out that he is of German ethnicity with Florentine citizenship. So my book addresses this broad meta-narrative about the development of the Italian early Renaissance culture and history at different levels. From a disciplinary point of view, the book starts with diplomacy, then turns to economy, and the third chapter is dedicated to migration, and the fourth to the so-called high culture, even though I believe that the term high culture doesn't really gives back the exact content of the chapter. The book also addresses different geographical areas and types of polities within the Italian peninsula, ranging from the Kingdom of Naples or Kingdom of Sicily through the republics, mostly the Tuscan republics and Venice, until single cities under the rule of, under the influence of important local families, just like Milan or Padua. But they figure into the analysis in various modalities, conditioned from one side by the survival of sources, which would provide us with testimony to migration tendencies between these places, and also by the research carried out by me or by colleagues working on similar topics. My own primary source material comes predominantly from three places, from Florence, Rome, and Venice, but I also carried out exploratory research and in other places as well, which are included into the analysis in a minor share. From a structural point of view, the book addresses various layers of the society. And under society here, I mean people who circulated between Italy and the territories of the Hungarian-Croatian crown. And the book provides predominantly an agent-based analysis into this meta-narrative and to several less voluminous, but I think no less significant narratives in Renaissance scholarship, and stretches its social basis from slaves through unskilled and skilled workers and soldiers, merchants, all the way to royalty. What I was primarily looking for were patterns and trends in the behavior as migrants, as cultural mediators, or cultural agents. And as a previous monograph of mine, also this one talks very much about social networks, even though it doesn't apply graph theory to its data set. Yet I think the book is based on a rich data set, maybe unparalleled from this point of view, which data scientists might call, in this context, large in volume, high throughput, and great in variety. And obviously here I need to emphasize once again that all these categories mean to describe big data in relative terms in the context of other available data sets of this sort. And I have just an upcoming article on that issue, and you could see an outline of the appendix, which would show what kind of data I included as big data into the analysis. Now, in the next few minutes, I'd like to walk you through the various chapters, just briefly, before turning to the main topic of my talk. Chapter 1 discusses diplomacy, as I said, and the geopolitics and the political structure of the polities involved into the analysis. Following this, it deals with three distinctive social groups, which shall be identified as key diplomatic actors, including royalty of the Hungarian and of Naples, Italian ambassadors to the royal court, and finally, Italian churchmen who either received offices in Hungary or traveled to the kingdom as representatives of the popes. The second chapter introduces the question of Italian commercial centers and their role as sites of production, both industrial and agricultural production and trade. Here, three other social groups are analyzed: Italian-born businessmen employed in the royal administration, merchant bankers who installed banking facilities in the kingdom and monopolized, I believe, banking, especially in relation to Italian financial centers, just like Venice, Florence, and the Apostolic Chamber. And finally, the third group, international merchants, even though these three categories shall not be divided from each other sharply. And I also talk about this in this chapter. Chapter 3 considers three major Italian centers as migration sites for Hungarian subjects: Florence, Rome, and Venice. It discusses the ways in which Hungarian-born migrants were represented and clustered in these cities. And it also addresses the transmission of specific skills, for example, in the artisan domain by Italian immigrants in the Kingdom of Hungary. And here, the social basis of this chapter ranges from Christian slaves through skilled and unskilled workers, mercenaries, pilgrims, and members of religious orders. And I have addressed much of the questions discussed in this chapter in separate publications. Chapter 4 describes particularly the ways in which cultural production can be considered as an expression of political interest and business. And the three groups analyzed here are, from one side, the Hungarian-born university students, many of them clergymen, who studied in northern Italy. I relied much on the studies of Hungarian colleagues. They often developed these actors into significant diplomatic mediators as well. Italian humanists employed in the royal court are the second group. And also, the chapter ends with the profile of those Italian masters of the visual arts, painting, sculpture, and building projects who were employed in Hungary at that period. As a conclusion, I explained that these networks were primarily formed by commerce, migratory tendencies, and business networks. Diplomacy were interconnected by most typically by commercial interest, and how these networks and commerce contributed to cultural exchanges as a two-way process, not only from Italy to Hungary, but also from Hungary to Italy. And in the second part of the talk today, I wish to give my own account of the diplomatic contacts between, more specifically between Florence and Hungary, by focusing especially on the interweaving networks of commerce and diplomacy. And I do so by addressing the question of the existence of an Italian commercial consulate in Buda during the Sigismund Luxemburg's reign, and by analyzing some of the personal Florentine embassies under Matthias Corvinus. And I believe that while Hungarian monarchs' diplomatic maneuvers in Italy were generally conditioned by the dynastic networks and territorial aspirations, the diplomacy of the various Italian polities moved alongside other patterns and were typically grounded in two well-defined areas. From one side, in diplomatic support, including obtaining feudal titles and territorial legitimacy. And the other area was commercial interest. And the tight bond between the commerce and diplomacy was definitely a significant aspect of Italian diplomacy. And in many instances, as we know, merchants took a leading role in negotiations, and there are many studies drawing attention, most recently by Isabella Lazzarini, on the specificity of Renaissance diplomacy. And she has also pointed out that ambassadors use commercial networks, relying on them in every possible way for the success of their missions, to gather information around, for transport and loans, and seek shelter and food supply. So Italian merchants also proved to be effective intermediaries between local authorities and the ambassadors themselves. And so the coincidence between diplomatic missions and economic international commercial activity in Renaissance period was quite significant. And this aided exactly trading nations in obtaining economic advantages in the host countries. The diplomacy of the leading Italian trading nations like the Florentines, Venetians, and the Genoese moved alongside patterns that were deeply conditioned exactly by this commercial interest, which was the primary source of income of the ruling elite. Therefore, they installed institutions abroad which could serve both functions, both diplomatic and commercial functions. And the Venetians and the Genoese commercial consulates, as an institutionalized form of representation, trace their origins back to the 12th century, to the times of the Crusades. And for the Florentines, it was different. Since the last decade of the 14th century, and especially during the 15th century, the relationship between diplomacy and trade I think received a significant overhaul with the spread of Florentine consulates, but also joint ones where Florentines were involved. The consuls who acted also as judges were typically well-networked international merchants of a certain social status they obtained in the new society. And consulates definitely developed into permanent representation of Florentine merchants abroad, facilitating they trade in that particular area. And I believe that one of the most significant discoveries of the book is exactly the documented existence of an independent jurisdictional organization of Italian merchants in the city of Buda, which embraced at least half century. The entire reign of Sigismund of Luxembourg between 3087 and 4037. So the first source so far found comes from 1390, in which the Florentine consul is mentioned as the lead consul of Italian merchants. And I need to correct myself, he was of Paduan origins. And the last reference to the consul, the joint consul of Italians, or Italiani, Latini, as they call themselves, comes from 4036. And here you could see one of the documents I published in the appendix. These are completely new sources. I haven't published elsewhere thus far, and they are testimonies to the fact that this was a serious organization, a well-structured system, including a consul who acted also as judge, a vice judge, and also a council composed of other Italian merchants residing in Buda or in Hungary in general. The roots of this consulate, I believe, in my understanding, went back to the 3070s, when Florentines asked Louis I for trade privileges in the kingdom, saying that the Genoese had already obtained such privileges from Louis I. And in fact, we know that already in the 14th century, Venetians and Anconetans ran the independent consulate in Dalmatia and the city of Senia. Also in Belgrade, which in 1426 got under the Hungarian crown, Ragusans operated an independent consulate. So merchants from Ancona and Venice concentrated in Dalmatia, which makes sense that they were keeping their consulates there. Meanwhile, Florentines, starting from the 3070s, were quite everywhere in the kingdom. And so I believe that was the reason why they kept the consulate in the proximity of the royal court, because Buda developed into the seat of the Hungarian king starting from the first decade of the 15th century. So we are talking about here of a joint consulate, including not only Florentines, but also Siennese, Paduan merchants, and I believe also Aretines, even though we don't have direct information of Aretine merchants being involved in the organization or in the running of the consulate itself. The independent consulate Italian consulate in Buda was one of the earliest established beyond the Alps. It succeeded such leading commercial centers as Naples and Venice, and two cities which were of crucial importance for Florentine's trade abroad, beyond Tuscany. And before the consulate in Buda, according to the researches carried out by Sadiq Cartier, Florentines had established their own consulates only in four other cities, in Avignon, Bruges, Constantinople, and Seville, which were of crucial importance exactly for their trade. So following, the interesting thing is that following Sigismund's death in 1437, there are no more news about the existence of a comparable institution of Italian merchants in Buda. This could be because of the availability of sources on one side, or because of the lack of such a system and such an institution. In the last part of my talk, I intend to downplay the theory regarding the leading role played by the amicable diplomatic relations based on mutual appreciation between Matthias and Lorenzo de' Medici in the development of the Florentine-Hungarian relations. Matthias was elected to the Hungarian throne in 1458, and already 30 years later, in 1471, I believe that important domestic events occurring in the kingdom might have distanced some of the members of the Florentine political elite from Matthias' court. In April 1472, the Florentine ambassador named Baldovino wrote from Buda to Lorenzo de' Medici that he was dismissed from the court. His letter provides testimony to the plot of János Rednai, Archbishop of Esztergom, who was the most important church dignity in Hungary, against the ruler, in which the Archbishop's nephew, János Pannonius, who is also Bishop of Pécs, was involved. Both these figures had extensive connections in Italy, one of the possible reasons why the ambassador was treated with suspicion by Matthias. And Baldovino was most probably acquainted with both the archbishop and the bishop themselves. All three of them were highly educated men of their times. János, a poet himself, studied in Italy. Meanwhile, Zrednai, for many experts, serves as an example of those first-generation Hungarian-born learned men who developed an appreciation for classical authors. Baldovino is most probably could be identified with a notary active earlier in the Archbishopric of Florence, who composed various works of hagiographic and theological nature, testimonies of his intellectual preparation. So Baldovino's letter to Lorenzo also describes the role the papal legate played as a mediator in favor of Zrednai and the general uncertainty that he personally faced as the diplomatic representative of Lorenzo in the court. Following the plot, Zrednai died, so did János Pannonius on his way to Venice, where he intended to settle as an exile. Just like another leading baron involved into the plot, János Lakitus, who managed to get to Venice and who found shelter there and was buried 17 years later as member of the Scuola Grande di San Marco. And this was the discovery of Reinhold Müller a couple of years ago. At that moment, I believe that the ambassador Baldovino's situation in the royal court might have resembled the one following Pippo Scolari's death, when some Florentines were surrounded by a general mistrust of the ruler. The peak of the diplomacy between Matthias and the various Italian polities came in the 1470s. And the major preoccupation from one side, obviously, was the question of the wedding between Beatrice and Matthias Corvinus. But other than that, there was also an Ottoman question, which bore a significant economic dimension also for the Italian trading nations. Florentines and Venetians, for them, the resistance to the Ottomans was not purely about the question of religion or politics, but it remained, as always been, about the business interest, about the survival of the merchant networks. So Lorenzo de' Medici's envoy to report about the wedding ceremony was Giovanni Domenico Ginori from the leading Medici family, Filo Medici family, international merchant and leading art patron. And in 1476, Giovanni arrived to Hungary, and following the royal court, he also traveled to the southern parts of the kingdom in the area of Belgrade, where he witnessed exactly the anti-Ottoman campaigns in Srebrenica and Szabadka. As I said, Belgrade and 6 other castles on the Danube got under the Hungarian crown in 1426, when the Serbian despot asked for protection against the Ottomans. The seat of the despot, Belgrade, which was also a regional and international center of trade, but especially significant for Ragusan's trade. As I said, they kept a consulate there, but there was also Florentines occasionally mentioned in sources. So Giovanni Domenico Ginori, in his letter to Lorenzo, mentioned the mercantile activity in these locations and the silver mines located in the territory, which bore strategic importance for both sides. And during his stay, Ginori, through the eyes of a merchant, observed and documented the richness and the economic potential of the territory. Was it merely the curiosity of a professional or part of his mission? Most probably it was both. Following that, several studies have drawn attention to the fact that Florence, but also other Italian polities at the time, already at this period started to keep ambassadors longer in foreign courts, so the development of the residential nature of embassies. In the case of the Hungarian royal court, this residential nature of the Italian embassies is best exemplified by 2 Florentine diplomats, both merchant origins, who enjoyed the royal couple's hospitality for several years. And among them was Domenico di Bernardo Giugni, whose family had already been operating in Hungary since the times of Sigismund of Luxembourg, so it's like at least half a century. His father, Domenico, so Bernardo, in 1438, was already sent as ambassador to the Hungarian King Albert to recommend him Florentine merchants who were previously mistreated by Sigismund by confiscating his goods, their goods in Hungary. So Domenico, his son, arrived with Lorenzo de' Medici's commission to Matthias court sometimes in 1475. And in the following years, he was put in charge of important administrative positions by the king and was also engaged in business ventures in the kingdom. In 1480, in his letter written from Zagreb, he called himself Consigliere del Re. In 1481, a privilege issued by Matthias Corvinus Chancellery referred to him as the head of the royal 30th chamber in Slavonia. The 30th chamber was normally the one which handled customs in Hungary, especially it was set up for handling the customs of precious metals. And he operated there with another Florentine international merchant, Alessandro Attavanti. Owing to the Queen Beatrice's mediation, the two were also involved in trade in the royal court with silk textiles. The interesting is how his career develops after this. In 1485, one of his letters from Buda directed to Lorenzo de' Medici alludes to the fact that Domenico worked as a local representative of the Medici firm. At the same time, he acted in the capacity of resident ambassador, providing Lorenzo with information of all sorts from the royal court. Probably because of this, for this reason, Matthias' trust in Domenico didn't last forever. And eventually, Lorenzo asked the king to let Domenico go back to Florence. But he was still in Buda in 1488, already being held in detention. And following the Filo Medici, Baldovino's, and Domenico Bernardo Giugni's mistreatment in the royal court, The example of Francesco Giovanni Bandini Baroncelli, a cleric with humanist education and a deep interest in visual arts, draws our attention to another side of Matthias' diplomacy. Francesco was earlier serving the court of Naples and probably arrived to Hungary with Queen Beatrice. In addition to intellectual motivation, there might have been also a commercial motivation which brought him to the Hungarian royal court. While in Buda, he developed close friendship with some other international merchants, the already mentioned Alessandro Attavanti, who is working at the chambers, and Simone Gondi, who is a resident merchant in Buda. The Baroncelli brothers, Bernardo and Francesco's political ambitions were coupled with a strong international mercantile activity in the Ottoman lands. In 1478, Bernardo, a renewed merchant, was involved in a conspiracy conceived by Jacopo exactly and Francesco Pazzi against the Medici brothers. In April 1478, it was most probably Bernardo and his fellows assassinating Giuliano de' Medici. Owing to his commercial and family networks, Bernardo had great connections in the Florentine community of Pera, including his relative, the earlier Florentine consul Carlo Jacopo Baroncelli, who might have helped him finding shelter in Pera following the unsuccessful plot. The Ottomans, who were already on amicable terms with Lorenzo, willingly captured Bernardo and transported him back to Florence, where he was sentenced to death. Already back in May 1478, in his letter sent from Buda, Francesco Baroncelli was trying to reassure Lorenzo that he remained his trusted man. This could likely be seen as a strategic move on Francesco's side, as his life was evidently at stake. As the conspiracy was a well-planned attack against the Medici, we would expect that Francesco's long stay in the royal court should have been accidental either. At least this is my theory here, and I'm just walking a fine line between theory and interpreting the sources. Is it possible that he didn't know anything about what his brother was aiming to achieve, or was he attempting to use extra-Italian diplomacy in their favor? Maybe the Bandini Baroncelli brothers were hoping for a favorable diplomatic climate in the royal court in case of victory, or the likelihood of an eventual failure of the conspiracy. And this would not be the only case and the first case in the history of Florentine-Hungarian relations. As earlier, my first monograph demonstrated, the Albizzi faction used their soon-to-be in-law ties to the Scolari to obtain further diplomatic support for the regime by King Sigismund. When Pippo Scolari died in 1426, his heirs cancelled the wedding plans between his niece and Rinaldo degli Albizzi's eldest son. Furthermore, in 1432, while in Siena, Sigismund gave orders to his new military captain, who was substituting Pippo Scolari, the Ragusan Matko Talovac, to recruit soldiers for aiding Siena against the Albizzi at Florence. In this case, Lorenzo Medici's amicable diplomatic, going back to the question of Lorenzo, amicable diplomacy with the Porta to promote Florentine trade interests in the territories controlled by the Ottomans surely did not match Matthias' interest. The last reference exactly to Francesco Giovanni Bandini Baroncelli in the royal court is datable to 1489, owing to the letter to Marsilio Ficino. And the fact that he probably didn't make his way back to Florence in Lorenzo de' Medici's life would suggest that indeed his permanence in the royal court, in his stay in the royal court, was permanent. At the same time, I believe that it shows also a different side of Matthias' behavior toward Lorenzo compared to the mistreatment of the two other Florentines who were of Philo Medici or Medici sympathizers. The three cases, I believe, reveal three interweaving and at the same time opposing carriers. The three examples may also indicate the real quality of the relationships between Matthias Corvinus and Lorenzo de' Medici. Lorenzo was on amicable terms with the Porta, with Mehmed II and Bayezid II, which went against the Hungarian king's political interest. And it may look like, even as a contradiction, that while the Medici agglomerate was circulating the papal subvention between the Apostolic Chamber and Hungary to finance the anti-Ottoman wars, at the same time, Lorenzo de' Medici was negotiating with the Sultan for further trade privileges for Florentine merchants in his territories. The Medici agglomerate had significant business interests both in Hungary and Ottoman Empire, which required the Magnificent to be able to navigate effectively between these two great powers. The interpretation of earlier scholarship regarding the leading role played by Matthias in the development of Florentine-Hungarian relations compared to Sigismund and to Louis I finds its contraposition also in the scarcity of references to Italians in administrative positions. During Sigismund's reign, the multi-level operation, rooted in the 3070s, exactly in Louis I's time, stood in sharp contrast with the diminished significance in the royal administration during Matthias' reign. And I believe that on the basis of many circumstances and many considerations, we need to reevaluate the importance of the diplomacy in the development of Florentine-Hungarian relations through these 150 years with which my book is concerned. And two last words. As I mentioned to you at the beginning of my talk, that unfortunately in the academic year 2019-20, I was not able to carry out all the archival researches which I planned for the present volume, but the good news is, as already Alex mentioned, I am working on a third monograph into which I'm going to incorporate much of the findings which I managed to unveil in archival corresponding archives, mostly located on the western shores of the Adriatic. And this is a picture from the new book project, Mare Nostrum Adriaticum. And thank you very much for your attention. I hope I was more or less on time.